Good afternoon. This is Dick Carlson from high atop almost nothing here in sunny Lexington, South Carolina. I'm here with another edition of what we call Talking About CTE Teaching. My guest today is Joanna Goodman. Wave at the people, Joanna. She says she's just south of London in Surrey, and not too far away from any of those great tourist places that all of us Yankees know about. So I can place her. She says the weather there is not nearly as nice as what I'm experiencing here in South Carolina. And since I moved here for good weather, I'm really, really glad to hear that we've got some better weather than somebody else. She's been gracious enough to agree to talk with us a little bit today. So what we're talking about today is called assessment for learning. Traditional assessment, we all know how that works. You wait till the end of your course, and then you measure who won and who lost, who learned the material and who didn't. And there's a whole different way to go about that, and Joanna is at the front of that. She's both a working high school teacher, she's been in the trenches where you are, and she's also a researcher and a writer on this. Joanna, what the dickens is assessment for learning?
Right. First of all, I'd like to say hello to everybody. I think it's good afternoon to some and good evening to others, as we are, I think, we live across various different time zones. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to Dick Carlson, for masterminding the whole webcast. Indeed, I am here to talk about assessment for learning, something I am passionate about, because although the word assessment is being used, it is more about learning and how to engage with students during the learning processes than about the assessment itself. I will probably start with a very brief quote from the work done by the gurus of assessment for learning, Paul Black and Dylan William. And they define assessment for learning as any assessment for which the first priority in its design and practice is to serve the purpose of promoting pupils' learning. It thus differs from assessments designed primarily to serve the purposes of accountability or of ranking or of certifying competence. So as such, it is different from measuring progress at the end of test, which is an assessment that we refer to as summative assessment. Assessment for learning is described as formative assessment in a different way, because it gives formative comments for improvement. An assessment for learning, in a way, is a process of interpreting evidence for use by learners and their teachers to decide where the learners are in their learning, where they need to get, and how best to get there.
Well, that makes kind of a perfect sort of sense that rather than waiting until the complete end of the quarter or the end of the semester or the end of the year, the way they always did it to me, and then saying, well, you did real well at this, but you really were awful at that. If there was some way I could have gotten more feedback and help as a learner in the midst of it, that, they taught me to hate assessment. They really taught me to hate tests, as probably most of the people on board with us today would agree.
That's why the assessment we're talking about is primarily concerned with improving learning as we go along. It is something that is probably happening in most classrooms anyway, whether consciously or subconsciously, at the subconscious level. But we're talking about being more explicit in making it part of the classroom practice, because there is overwhelming evidence that it improves learning. And we're talking about learning through active participation, through involving pupils in their learning and all the learning processes, which in turn then leads to deep learning and advancing understanding. So the involvement of pupils in the process is absolutely at the heart of assessment for learning. And the aim of it is to make pupils independent of teachers so they can manage their own learning.
Could you give me an example of how that works with a student in a classroom where you involve them and make them independent of the teacher?
Okay. There are various processes, but to sum up, I think just a few examples. It is through sharing learning intentions, learning objectives with pupils, so they know what they're supposed to learn at the end of the course or a lesson or activity. It is involving them in their learning through self-assessment and peer assessment. And it is part of that dialogic interaction between the teacher and the learner as opposed to didactic style of teaching. So it is about coaching rather than working with the students rather than telling them what to do. Indeed, the word assessment comes from the Latin word assidere, which means to sit beside. And I believe it sort of refers originally to sitting as an assistant judge in the context of tax cases. And with assessment for learning, we sit and do things with the learner rather than to them. And that probably is happening in a lot of classrooms already without sort of calling it the assessment for learning. It is a way of teaching that involves the learner and makes them independent. It's about shifting the locus of control from the teacher to the learner. And the aim of that is to allow pupils, to make pupils masters of their own learning so they can manage their own learning and progress at their own pace.
Now, this sounds like it's an awful lot of extra time and effort and work for me as a teacher. Why do I want to go to all this trouble? You know, I'm going to have to find ways to share out the progress of the pupils, and you talked about peer-to-peer assessment, and why do I want to do all of this extra work as a teacher in the classroom? I mean, Mrs. Larson in my first grade classroom waited till I was done with penmanship and then just, you know, put that big red F on it and it was done. Tell me what's in it for me as a teacher.
Okay. It seems that there is an awful lot of work, and indeed, it does need a change in methodology, a certain shift. And some teachers are uncomfortable with it, especially teachers that have taught in a didactic, well, by telling for a long time. However, I have worked in classrooms, and I'm a practitioner and have practiced it for many years. And when you actually start applying the principles of student involvement in their learning, you find that actually this process of teaching becomes easier because teachers can step back and be more facilitators of learning, like a coach. And I do sort of make analogies to sports and business coaching. It is a way of asking questions and moving someone along without telling them. And it doesn't involve an awful lot of work. It involves a shift in the teaching methodology. That shift, I would emphasize again, is the shift in the locus of control from the teacher to the learner, and also feedback. Effective feedback and questioning are absolutely paramount to the process. And at the end, once the practice is embedded, it actually is very helpful to the teacher because they know exactly where the learners are. They can adjust teaching to learning, to assessment, because assessment informs their teaching. And also, it's absolutely invaluable for feedback to parents, because effective feedback should include where the learners are, where they need to get, and how to get there. So that specific guidance for next steps in learning is actually what parents need to know, and students. What do I need to do to achieve that higher level. And to that end, I always like to emphasize that with grades, with sort of summative assessment, there is always a ceiling to learning. And also it can reinforce failure or mediocrity, because some students at the lower end maybe always see themselves as C graders, and they are satisfied if they get a C, so they don't need to do any more. And likewise, the more able students can be just satisfied with getting the top grade A and feeling that they don't need to do any more. Whereas I feel there is no ceiling on learning, because there is always the next step. And it's giving that guidance is actually not only helpful to improvement in achievement and ultimately in those summative assessments, but it also keeps the teacher informed along the whole process where the learners are, which is invaluable for giving feedback to parents, for example.
Well, that's really great. One of the added things that we added to our software tool not too long ago was a screen that comes up when the learner enters the online learning, and it's almost like a little traffic board, a little dashboard, and there's red areas and green areas and yellow areas that tells them what they'd accomplished. And I was out in a classroom, and I was very, very surprised that the learners loved that. They were very excited that it would come up and show them what they'd done, what they hadn't, almost like a video game that showed them, what levels they had to do and which items they had to go find in the forest, and, that people like to know where they are and what they're doing, and I think that's a key part of it. So if I'm a teacher and I want to start doing some of this, where do I start? Where do I go? Where do I find information? How do I move forward in starting to apply this in my classroom?
Right, mentioning the traffic system, you just summed up the essence of assessment for learning beautifully, and I'll come back to that, because the online tools are a great way of advancing that, because of the opportunity for instant feedback, which improves learning. Now, where do you start? I think everybody should start small and maybe just implement one or two ideas from assessment for learning. And I think the key would be planning the learning intentions, because sharing the learning intentions shifts the locus of planning a lesson from planning it as an activity or series of activities to planning for outcomes. So clear understanding of what pupils are trying to learn and communicating that to them, which is being quite explicit with the learning objectives, shifts the focus from doing something to actually learning something. So I think that at the planning stage, thinking about planning appropriate learning objectives or learning outcomes is a good thing to start. Because if pupils know what the learning outcomes are, what is expected of them, they know how to recognize achievement, and they know what good looks like, that success criteria, what they need to achieve at the end of a unit or lesson. Mm-hmm. And that gives this bigger picture to learning. It also helps with motivation, because they know what they're supposed to achieve, and it helps with gaining learning independence. So there are many processes involved, because learning is quite a complex business, and there have been many theories written about it. But at a sort of classroom level, when the students are actively involved in what they're supposed to be learning, it's surprising how it even helps with managing behavior, because they are focused on the learning outcome rather than the activity. And I think thinking about good learning objectives, which is not what I'm doing today, but what I will be able to know or understand or analyze by the end of this lesson or a unit, is a good way to start. Another thing I would say at the planning stage and during lesson is thinking about effective questions, open questions that allow students to reason and connect their learning. So it's about the quality of dialogic interaction between teachers and students. And there are sort of various tricks here as well. Well, not so much tricks, but things to help teachers. Research has found that teachers generally don't leave enough time for pupils to answer the questions. It's usually less than a second before they give the answer or ask someone that is very sort of enthusiastic with his hand up to answer the question, whilst leaving others out of the process. So extending the time and also the hands-down approach, because that allows everybody to think about the answer rather than those that tend to participate,
Right.
because they are louder than others.
So take a second and give me an example of a poorly formed question and a well-formed question in any subject. Doesn't matter what's riding a bike or chemistry, or give me an example of a question that maybe will not elicit what we need, and then a better formed version of that.
I think all the questions that start with how rather than what are good questions, because what probably just checks on facts, assesses facts, whereas how would you go about something, or it's my subject especially is English, so maybe you would say, how could you extend that piece of writing? It involves some kind of reasoning, rather than a simple question, what would you do next? So there are the how questions, the open questions that encourage thinking and independence. Planning for pair work, group work, peer assessment and self-assessment, and thinking about the plenary. Plenary is sort of, towards the end of the activity, asking for feedback. And you mentioned the traffic lights, and that's an instant feedback, and students love that.
Right.
It could be just a simple question, how have you learned this lesson? Make them think, what was it? Was it the use of visuals? Was it through peer work? And it's that sort of feedback that then informs future teaching, because teachers can adjust their teaching to the feedback so they reach every student in the class. So it is that ongoing process of assessing rather than measuring progress at the end of the unit.
That's great.
Regarding written work, is giving effective comments for improvement without grades, comments on next steps, specific comments of what to do, and trying to avoid praise like, well done, this is a good piece of work, because that is ego enhancing, and comments should be related to learning, to the task, rather than to the person. Because this I'm drawing now on Dweck's research, an American psychologist, the ego enhancing comments actually narrow learning, because they think, oh, I've done well, he is good boy, well done, I don't need to do any more. That type of thing. Whereas, well, I can give you an example of a good and bad feedback comment. Again, drawing from my subject area, why haven't you written in paragraphs or write in paragraphs? And the student would probably think, well, if I knew how to do it, I would have done it. It's the specific comment that is needed. When you change time, location, character, you need to start a new paragraph. and this would be the next target for improvement. And it's just a way of shifting that everyday practice and making those formative comments on a few pieces of work during, you probably wouldn't do it on every piece of work, and not every piece of work lends itself to formative comments. But those type of comments give teachers very precise information where the students are in their learning, where they need to get, and what they need to do to get there. And the same information is shared with pupils. So they're working together. So although it seems like an awful lot of work in the first instance, it actually works beautifully in practice. And it allows teachers to adjust teaching to learning.
Great. I'm a fan. Now, we've only got a few minutes left, and I do have a couple of questions that have come in. One involves, you talked about online tools and technology that help do this, and said there were a lot of helpful things that were available. Could you expand on that a little bit?
I wanted to refer that online technology can play fabulous parts in advancing the assessment for learning because of instant feedback, because that feedback can identify next steps in learning if the assessment is sort of formatively sensitive, and there are adaptive type of testing that can actually, as the student progresses through the test, adapt to the learning and answers in identifying those next steps for learning. Feedback that shows improvement on past learning, not comparison with others, again, is motivating, and this is what students get when they interact with an online activity. They are able to self-assess and self-evaluate work, which again are self-motivating tools and leads to the learning independence for learning sustainability. Modeling good examples and success criteria is fairly easy done with online tools as well. And that leads to motivation and developing that learning independence for learning sustainability. And another beauty of online tools is that they can progress at their own pace as well. And that is motivating towards future success.
Great.
So it's the quality of those assessments that matters. But good assessment provide instant feedback.
Okay.
And there is no better motivation than having that instant feedback for future learning.
Okay, another question here. You talked about peer-to-peer assessment. Can you talk a little bit more about how a teacher sets that up and how you make it work, having students actually assess each other?
Absolutely. They need to be trained. They need to be taught what to look for and how to assess. So teachers would need to make it as planned practice for a particular lesson or activity that this lesson will involve peer assessment. An example, again, that I can draw from my practice and the way I do it, for example, sharing, first of all, success criteria for a particular assignment in English. Like, this is what a good discursive essay looks like, by giving them an example and discussing good parts of the essay, what is good about it. And then for students to write, to perform a written task, and then to swap work and look for the elements of good practice. And surprisingly, students, even of a very young age, I'm talking about primary pupils, primary elementary school pupils, can be very mature in how they approach their task. And sometimes there is no better way of learning than teaching somebody else. And peer assessment is absolutely at the heart of the assessment for learning. And similar with self-assessment, when they know the success criteria that they can assess against, they will do that in a very mature fashion.
That's great. I do have to say, as an instructional designer, I've learned over the years the best way to learn anything is to have to teach it to somebody. That in my work, when I have to go out and do the research to find out something I'm going to teach. So that's a great way, I think, to end this. We've come to the end of our time, and I really want to thank Joanna Goodman for taking her time to speak with us about this. As you can see on the screen there, I've got a link to her website. And I certainly welcome you to go there, and there's far more information than we just had today. Also, if you're attending this live, or if you sign up to see it on a recording, we'll be sending you out a link to some further information that she gave us, and also to a great article that she wrote, so you'll be able to see that. And I think you're going to be better teachers for having thought about this. And maybe the word assessment will not send chills quite as far up and down your spine. It certainly makes me feel a little bit better now to realize that maybe I don't have to worry about checking off multiple choice questions and that big red F that I used to see on there in the classroom. So thank you, Joanna, very much, and I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Pleasure to talk to you. Yep. Bye-bye.